The moment I saw my mother-in-law's name flash across my phone screen, my stomach dropped like a stone. I'd never meant for her to see that text. It was meant for my sister, a raw, unfiltered moment of hurt and frustration after years of swallowing my feelings. But in that single accidental message, everything I'd carefully hidden came rushing to the surface. And what happened next changed our family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember staring at my phone in horror, watching those 3 little dots appear as she typed her response. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst through my chest. 7 years of careful peacekeeping, of protecting my children, from rejection, of pretending everything was fine. All of it undone by a single text sent to the wrong person. The text was simple, but devastating in its honesty. I'm done pretending we're welcome for the holidays. This year I'm making our own Thanksgiving traditions with the kids. They deserve better than being treated like afterthoughts by Tom's family. I'd meant to send it to my sister Kate after hearing that. Once again, my children had been excluded from the real family Thanksgiving. But instead, I'd accidentally sent it to Margaret, my mother-in-law, the architect of so many painful family gatherings. Let me back up a bit. My name is Jessica. I'm 36, a kindergarten teacher, and mother to Emma and Noah, ages 10 and 8. I married Tom 11 years ago. Kind, brilliant Tom, who never saw the subtle ways his family kept us at arm's length. Or maybe he saw but couldn't bear to acknowledge it. From the beginning, there was a distance. Margaret and Richard, Tom's parents, were polite but reserved. His sister Allison and her husband Derek had children the same ages as mine. But the cousins were never encouraged to bond. There were always 2 tables at family gatherings, the adult table and the kids' table. Somehow, though, Allison's children frequently got invited to sit with the adults, while mine remained separated. It wasn't just the seating arrangements. It was the Christmas presents that were slightly less expensive, the family photos where my children were positioned at the edges, the stories about family traits that somehow never included my kids' characteristics. 1,000 paper cuts that, over time, left scars only I could see. Tom would say I was being too sensitive. That's just how my mom is, he'd tell me. She doesn't mean anything by it. But mothers know. We feel the slight chill when someone looks at our children with a touch of detachment. We notice when our kids try harder and harder to be accepted, only to retreat into themselves when it never quite happens. The breaking point came last week when Margaret called to discuss Thanksgiving plans. She spoke animatedly about the special table settings, the traditional family recipes, how wonderful it would be to have everyone together. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, and Jessica, I was thinking this year we'd do something different. Since the house will be so full with everyone coming, maybe you could drop the children at your mother's for the day. It would give you and Tom a chance to really relax and enjoy adult conversation." I felt like I'd been slapped. My mother lived 3 states away. She was spending Thanksgiving with my brother this year. And even if that wasn't the case, the suggestion that my children, her grandchildren, should be sent away for the family holiday felt like the final confirmation of what I'd suspected for years. They weren't considered real members of the family. I mumbled something non-committal and ended the call. That night, after the kids were in bed, I poured a glass of wine and typed out that fateful text to my sister. Except my trembling fingers tapped Margaret instead of Kate. I didn't realize my mistake until I saw her name appear with those typing dots. My blood ran cold. I couldn't take it back. I couldn't pretend it was meant for someone else. The raw truth of my feelings was there in black and white, delivered directly to the person I'd been tiptoeing around for years. 5 minutes passed. 10. The dots appeared and disappeared. I sat frozen, unable to move, barely breathing. Then, finally, a response. I think we need to talk. Can you come over tomorrow morning? Just you. No anger, no denial, just a request. That felt more like a summons. I didn't sleep that night. I rehearsed explanations, apologies, defenses. By morning, I was exhausted but resolute. This conversation was 7 years overdue. Margaret's house was exactly what you'd expect. Tasteful, traditional, every surface spotless, and every item in its proper place. I'd always felt slightly disheveled, there, slightly wrong, as though my mere presence disrupted the perfect order she maintained. She opened the door wearing a cardigan the color of autumn leaves, her silver hair neatly styled, her expression unreadable. "Come in," she said simply. "I've made coffee." We sat in her immaculate living room, the space between us filled with years of unspoken tension. I waited for her to speak first, clutching my coffee mug like a shield. "I've been thinking about your text all night," she finally said, her voice steady. At first I was angry, then hurt, then defensive. She paused, looking down at her hands. "But somewhere around 3 a.m, I started to wonder if maybe you were right." I nearly dropped my mug. Of all the reactions I'd anticipated, self-reflection hadn't been one of them. "Do you really think I've treated Emma and Noah differently?" she asked, and for the first time in our relationship, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. The question hung in the air between us. This was my moment, to speak my truth or to retreat into the safety of politeness as I'd done for years. I took a deep breath. "Yes," I said simply. "I do." And then, like a dam breaking, words poured out of me. All the moments, large and small, when my children had been made to feel less than. The Christmas morning when Allison's kids received personalized stockings while mine got generic ones. The family reunion where the family tree display didn't include my children's names. The way she corrected Noah's table manners but laughed when her other grandchildren did the same things. I spoke without anger, without accusation, just stating the patterns I'd observed year after year. As I talked, Margaret's face changed, from defensive to surprised to something I couldn't quite read. When I finally ran out of words, the silence was deafening. I waited for denial, for justification, for the cold dismissal I'd grown so accustomed to. Instead, Margaret set down her coffee cup with a shaking hand and said something that changed everything. I had no idea. I started to protest. How could she not know? But she held up her hand. "Please, let me finish. I'm not saying I didn't do these things. I'm saying I didn't recognize what I was doing." She looked directly at me then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've spent my life being the perfect mother, the perfect grandmother, the perfect hostess. Everything had to be just so. Everything had to follow tradition. When Tom married you..." She paused, struggling for words. "You were so different from what I expected. So independent. So modern in your parenting. Your children were loud and creative and messy. They didn't fit into my idea of what grandchildren should be. And instead of adapting, I think I just withdrew." She reached for a tissue, dabbing at her eyes. "I never meant to make them feel unwelcome. I just didn't know how to connect with them. Or with you." I sat stunned, trying to process this. Unexpected vulnerability from a woman I'd only ever seen as rigid and judgmental. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked softly. Margaret looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "Because your text made me realize I'm losing something precious. Time with my grandchildren. A relationship with you. I spent all night looking at family photos. And do you know what I noticed? In every picture from the last few years, Emma and Noah are smiling at the camera but not with their eyes. They're going through the motions, just like you've been." She looked up at me, tears now flowing freely. "I don't want that. I don't want to be the grandmother they tolerate. I want to be someone they love, someone who knows them. But I don't know how to fix this. For 7 years, I'd cast Margaret as the villain in our family story. The cold, judgmental mother-in-law who would never accept my children. I'd never considered that she might be insecure, that her rigidity might be fear, that she might be as lost in our relationship as I was. I think, I said carefully, we could start with Thanksgiving. We talked for hours that morning, really talked, perhaps for the first time. I learned that Margaret had grown up in a strictly traditional household where children were expected to be seen and not heard. That her own mother-in-law had been critical and demanding, setting standards Margaret had spent decades trying to meet. That she envied the easy, affectionate relationship I had with my children, but didn't know how to create it with her own grandchildren. By the time I left, we had a plan. Thanksgiving would be different this year. Really different. Not just Emma and Noah being invited, but being central to the celebration. Margaret suggested they might help prepare some of the dishes, that we could incorporate some of our family traditions alongside theirs. She even asked if there were foods my children particularly enjoyed that could be added to the menu. I drove home with my mind spinning, equal parts hopeful and skeptical. 1. Conversation couldn't undo years of hurt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. One moment of vulnerability couldn't guarantee lasting change, but it was something, a crack in the wall that had stood between our families for so long. At home, I told Tom what had happened. He looked stunned, then relieved, then guilty. I should have seen it, he said quietly. I should have said something. We both should have, I admitted. Instead of talking about your mother, we should have been talking to her. The real test came that evening when Margaret called and asked to speak to Emma and Noah. I put the phone on speaker, watching their faces carefully, ready to intervene if needed. "Hello, you two," Margaret said, her voice warmer than I'd ever heard it when addressing my children. "I was wondering if you might help me with something important for Thanksgiving." Emma and Noah exchanged confused glances. They were used to being peripheral to holiday preparations, not essential to them. "I was thinking about our family traditions," Margaret continued, "and I realized we don't have any that are just ours. Yours, mine, and Grandpa Richard's. So I thought maybe we could start some. Would you like to come over this weekend and help me test some new recipes? Maybe you have favorites we could add to the meal." The silence stretched for a moment as my children processed this unprecedented invitation. Then Noah, my cautious, thoughtful son, spoke up. "I really like pumpkin chocolate chip cookies," he said tentatively. "Mom and I make them every fall." "Pumpkin chocolate chip cookies sound wonderful," Margaret replied, and the genuine enthusiasm in her voice made Noah's eyes widen in surprise. "Could you bring your recipe when you come? I'd love to learn how to make them." By the time the call ended, concrete plans had been made. Emma had suggested a thankfulness craft she'd learned at school. Noah had shyly mentioned his interest in the family history Margaret was always talking about. And my mother-in-law had listened, really listened, to their ideas with an openness I'd never witnessed before. After the kids bounded off to tell their father about the weekend plans, I picked up the phone again. "Margaret," I said softly, "thank you." There was a pause then. "I should be thanking you, Jessica, for having the courage to send that text, accidental as it was, and for giving me a chance to do better." We still had a long road ahead. One conversation, one invitation couldn't erase years of patterns. Trust would take time to build, for me, for my children, even for Margaret herself, as she learned new ways of being a grandmother. There would be missteps and old habits resurfacing. There would be moments when the past felt more powerful than our intentions for the future. But as I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel after my accidental text. Hope. That weekend, something remarkable happened in Margaret's kitchen. My children, initially shy and uncertain, gradually relaxed as their grandmother welcomed their help, their ideas, their presence. Emma spilled flour on the immaculate counter, and instead of the tense cleanup I expected, Margaret laughed and showed her how to make handprints in the powder. Noah asked questions about family stories I'd heard a dozen times, but Margaret told them differently now, including details about Tom as a child that made my quiet son grin with recognition of himself in his father. Richard, Tom's father, wandered in and out of the kitchen, initially bewildered by the change in his wife's typical holiday preparation routine. By afternoon, though, he was sitting at the table with Noah, showing him old family photos and answering his curious questions with a patience I hadn't known he possessed. When Tom arrived to pick us up, he stopped in the doorway, visibly stunned by the scene before him. His mother teaching Emma to crimp pie crust, his father and son hunched over a family album, the kitchen bearing cheerful evidence of actual use, rather than the pristine showroom it usually resembled. "What's happening here?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "We're making Thanksgiving," Margaret answered simply. And somehow, in that moment, we all understood she meant something much bigger than the meal. The actual holiday was still a week away. There would be more conversations, more negotiations of space and traditions and expectations. Allison and Derek would need to be brought into this new vision of family gatherings. The children, all the cousins, would need time to find their way to genuine connection after years of artificial separation. But driving home that evening, with Emma and Noah chattering excitedly in the back seat about Grandma Margaret and her promise to teach them the secret family stuffing recipe, I felt as though we'd crossed an invisible threshold. The accidental text that had filled me with such dread had somehow opened a door I'd thought permanently closed. Tom reached across the center console and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes on the road but his meaning clear. "For what?" I asked. "For not giving up on us. All of us." That night, as I tucked Noah into bed, he asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, why was Grandma Margaret different today?" I considered how to answer, how much to explain about the complicated world of adult relationships, about hurt feelings and misunderstandings and the courage it takes to change. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "people don't know how they're coming across. They don't realize they're making others feel bad. Grandma Margaret didn't know how to be the kind of grandmother you and Emma needed, but she's learning now." Noah thought about this, his face serious in the glow of his nightlight. "Is that why she asked about my favorite foods? Because she's trying to learn about me?" "Yes," I said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "That's exactly why." He was quiet for so long I thought he might have drifted off to sleep. Then, in a small voice, "I think I like having a grandma who wants to know me." I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "I think she's going to like knowing you too." The days leading up to Thanksgiving, there were moments when doubt crept back in. What if this was temporary? What if Margaret reverted to old patterns once the initial shock of my text wore off? What if the holiday itself, with its stress and expectations, undid all our fragile progress? I shared these fears with Tom one night after the children were asleep. We sat on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets against the November chill, watching our breath form clouds in the cold air. "I'm trying to trust this change," I admitted. "But part of me is waiting for the other shoe to drop." Tom was quiet, for a long moment. "You know what I realized this week?" he finally said. "All these years I've been caught between you and my mother, trying to keep everyone happy, never really addressing the problem. I was so afraid of conflict that I let both of you suffer. You were right to send that text, accident or not." "But what if it doesn't last?" I pressed. "What if Thursday is a disaster?" He took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "Then, we'll handle it together." No more pretending everything's fine when it isn't. No more putting the kids in situations where they feel less than. If this is real change, wonderful. If it's not, he looked me in the eye. Then we make our own traditions, just like you said in your text. His words settled something in me. For the first time in our marriage, I felt truly seen in my concerns about his family. Whatever happened on Thanksgiving, we would face it as a united front. As it turned out, Thanksgiving itself wasn't perfect. How could it be, with so many years of patterns to overcome? There were awkward moments. Allison seemed bewildered by her mother's newfound interest in all the grandchildren equally. Derek made a few tone-deaf comments about real family that made me tense. Richard sometimes looked lost in the less structured, more inclusive gathering. But there were beautiful moments too. Margaret had set the table with place cards made by Emma, colorful hand-traced turkeys with each person's name. She'd included Noah's pumpkin chocolate chip cookies on the dessert table, with a little card identifying him as the baker. She'd found ways to incorporate each child into the meal preparation and made sure everyone, adults and children alike, had a chance to share what they were thankful for before we ate. Most meaningful of all was a moment I witnessed by accident. I was coming back from the kitchen when I overheard Noah asking Margaret why some of the photos on her mantel didn't have him and Emma in them. Instead of offering excuses or changing the subject as she might have done before, Margaret sat down beside him eye to eye. "That was a mistake on my part," she said clearly. "I wasn't being a very good grandma then, but I'd like to take some new photos today, with everyone together. Would you help me choose where to take them?" The naked honesty in her voice, the willingness to acknowledge her failure without defensiveness. It was a revelation. And Noah's response, a solemn nod and immediate suggestions for photo locations, showed me he was capable of far more emotional generosity than I'd given him credit for. As we gathered later for those photos, I stood back for a moment, watching my children position themselves naturally among their cousins, watching Margaret ensure everyone was included, watching Tom's face as he observed this sea change in his family dynamics. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the end of our journey, but it was real, and it mattered. Later, as we were preparing to leave, Margaret pulled me aside. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "We've always done Christmas Eve at our house, very formal, very structured. But this year, I wonder if we might try something different." I raised my eyebrows, waiting. "Would you consider hosting at your home?" she continued. "I'd like to see how your family celebrates. I think there's a lot I could learn." The vulnerability in that request, the humility, it moved me in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about including my children more fully. This was Margaret recognizing that her way wasn't the only way, that our family's traditions had value too. "We'd love that," I said sincerely. "It won't be as elegant as your celebrations, fair warning. There will be mismatched Christmas mugs, and probably pajamas until noon." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "That sounds wonderful, actually. Freeing." In the car on the way home, with two tired children dozing in the back seat, Tom reached for my hand again. "Thank you," he said simply. I didn't need to ask what for this time. We both knew. An accidental text had forced a conversation severed. Years overdue. A moment of raw honesty had created an opening for real connection. It wouldn't always be easy. Old habits would resurface. There would be missteps and disappointments, and the need for ongoing courage on all sides. But as we drove home through the gathering darkness, Christmas lights beginning to twinkle from houses along the way, I felt a sense of rightness, of pieces shifting into place. The family we were building wasn't defined by bloodlines or traditions, or someone else's expectations. It was defined by willingness to see each other, to hear each other, to grow together. My accidental text had been a moment of despair, of giving up on something I thought could never change. Instead, it had become a beginning. And for that, I was truly thankful. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle snowfall that coated our neighborhood in quiet white. Our house looked nothing like Margaret's pristine showcase. Mismatched stockings hung from the mantel, paper snowflakes taped to windows, and the scent of gingerbread filling every room. I felt a flutter of nervousness as I straightened the living room one last time. Would Margaret judge our humble decorations, our casual approach to holiday traditions? The doorbell rang at exactly 5 o'clock. I took a deep breath and opened the door to find Margaret and Richard standing on our porch, arms laden with gifts and food. But what struck me most wasn't the packages. It was Margaret's outfit. Instead of her usual formal attire, she wore a simple red sweater with a light-up Rudolph pin. Richard sported a Santa hat. "We weren't sure what to bring," Margaret said, a touch of uncertainty in her voice. "So we brought a little of everything." That evening unfolded in ways I never could have imagined. Margaret sat on the floor with Emma helping her arrange our nativity set. Richard taught Noah a card game his own grandfather had played. We ate pizza from paper plates because that was our Christmas Eve tradition, and neither of them commented on the lack of china or crystal. When it came time for our tradition of reading "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," Margaret asked if she could listen rather than take over. She watched, rapt, as Tom did all the silly voices that made the children giggle. I caught her wiping away, a tear when he finished. "We never read to Thomas like that," she whispered to me later. "Everything was so formal in our house. I didn't know it could be this way." Before they left, Margaret handed me a small package. "This is just for you," she said. "Open it after we go." Inside was a delicate silver frame holding a photo I'd never seen. Tom as a small boy, laughing wildly as he splashed in a puddle, his clothes muddied, his joy uncontained. On the back, Margaret had written, "I'm learning that family isn't about perfection. Thank you for teaching me." That Christmas marked the beginning of a new chapter for all of us. The changes weren't always smooth or straightforward. There were setbacks. Moments when old patterns reasserted themselves. When Margaret's perfectionism flared. When I felt myself bristling at perceived slights. But there was also something new: honesty. When tensions arose, we spoke about them directly rather than letting them fester. By the following Thanksgiving, the transformation was remarkable. Both families gathered at Margaret and Richard's home, but the rigidity was gone. Children and adults sat together at one long table. Allison, who had initially resisted the changes, gradually softened as she saw her children forming genuine bonds with their cousins. Noah and his grandfather developed a special relationship around model trains, spending hours together in Richard's workshop. Emma discovered that her grandmother had once been an amateur painter and begged for lessons. Margaret's initial hesitance gave way to genuine pleasure as she rediscovered a passion she'd set aside decades ago. Tom changed too. Freed from his role as family peacekeeper, he became more present, more engaged with our children and with his parents. I watched him laugh with his father in ways I'd never witnessed before, share stories about work challenges he would have previously kept to himself. As for me, I learned that family relationships aren't static, that patterns can be broken, bridges, rebuilt. That one moment of accidental honesty can sometimes unleash the truth everyone needed to hear. Last week, Margaret called to discuss plans for the upcoming holidays. "I was thinking," she said, "that this year we might do something completely different. What if we all rented a cabin for a few days? Somewhere the children could play in the snow, where we could all just be together without the pressure of hosting?" The suggestion, so unlike anything the old Margaret would have proposed, made me smile. "That sounds perfect," I told her. And I meant it. 3 years have passed since that accidental text changed everything. Not everything is perfect. We still have our differences, our moments of misunderstanding. But the walls that once divided us have crumbled, replaced by something stronger. The willingness to see each other as we truly are, to make space for imperfection, to choose connection over expectation. My children now have grandparents who know them, who celebrate their uniqueness rather than trying to mold them into a preconceived image. Tom has parents who see and appreciate the family we've built together. Richard and Margaret have discovered joy in relaxing the rigid standards they once imposed on themselves and everyone around them. And I've learned that sometimes the greatest gift is a mistake, a moment of unplanned honesty that creates the possibility of real change. That accidental text, sent in a moment of frustration, became the foundation for healing I never thought possible. As we prepare for another holiday season together, I find myself reflecting on how easily we might have continued down our separate paths, maintaining the facade of family while missing the reality of connection. How close we came to accepting a pattern of exclusion and distance as simply the way things are. Instead, we found the courage to begin again, to learn new ways of being family, to create traditions that embrace who we are rather than who we think we should be. That Thanksgiving when my children were excluded wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of a better one. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.